Exciting news to report. Our event, Inspiring Prevention of Eating Disorders and Body Image Issues, is going online. This is an eating disorders training event for sufferers, mental health professionals, counsellors, nutritionists, dietitians, personal trainers, and anyone with an interest in eating disorders prevention. And it is now online, bringing people together, sharing a passion for change around these issues. It is an event to inspire, educate, and connect with like-minded others. So why do we need this event? Well, we know that eating disorders are on the rise, and many people in our culture experience devastating distress around body image. And as a result of this, so many people are desperately struggling with their physical health, mental well-being, and self-worth. And we know that the incidence of eating disorders exploded in the pandemic, and we continue to experience the aftermath of this. And the Lancet Group recently published research in June 2023 revealing a 42% rise in eating disorders among teenage girls as a result of the lockdowns, with similar rates of self-harm in this demographic. We need change at grassroots level. We need to implement change in society, changing the narrative and helping people to find a newfound understanding around relationship with food, psychology, and body image. So be part of this change. We have brought together experts in the field to inspire and educate around prevention of these issues. And it's going to be a one-day event on the 30th of September 2023 online. We're going to be having lots of talks and workshops talking about the catastrophic impact of diet culture, looking at the early years as foundation for good mental health, talking about the hidden eating disorders with 85% of people not being underweight, looking at diagnosis, early intervention and support, talking about issues with men getting eating disorders too around muscularity, talking about improving body image and developing radical self-love, understanding a broader definition of health, intuitive eating principles, is sugar really the enemy, finding a healthy relationship with exercise and movement, dealing with diet culture, and lots more. So if you want to up-level your knowledge, be inspired, connect with others from all over the world and be part of this transformation, click the link in the bio of the show notes to get your ticket. Saturday 30th of September, see you there. Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. This is a podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. And I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. As today is a bite-sized episode and I want to just give you a whistle-stop tour of eating disorders. Okay, so I thought this might be particularly helpful perhaps if you are new to thinking that you may have an eating disorder, or maybe you have a loved one close to you who you sense is struggling, but you don't really know much about eating disorders, and for anyone else who might be interested. So this is just going to be like a bit of a whistle-stop tour. If you want more information though, I would really recommend that you go to the BEAT, B-E-A-T website. That's the BEAT Eating Disorders website, the National Association for Eating Disorders in the UK. And they have like very comprehensive information available and helplines and all kinds of info that will be incredibly valuable. So, some thoughts. If you've never had an eating disorder or experienced a loved one struggling, then you might feel quite mystified as to what can stop a person wanting to eat. Because I guess as human beings, for us, eating is a fundamental biological need. Why would someone want to deny themselves this basic thing for survival that really impacts our existence? So I think sometimes it's something that's really, really hard to understand. And of course, not all eating disorders are just restricting food. That is one aspect of it. You might also wonder about an eating disorder, whether it's all about vanity or achieving a certain aesthetic. And of course, we do live in a culture that absolutely does idealize thinness. And it may seem very much that eating disorders are all about this kind of pursuit of thinness. And although I think this is one aspect of eating disorders are psychological illnesses. People are really suffering. They are much more than about chasing a number on the scales or looking a certain way. But if you're sort of looking in, you might feel quite perplexed to notice that someone with an eating disorder has shockingly low levels of self-worth, and they'll often kind of hide their body accordingly. So often, if you think about it, if it was really all about kind of vanity and a certain aesthetic, people wouldn't really be hiding under layers and layers of baggy clothes. And usually, although people might set off on an eating disorder journey to try and feel better about themselves, usually the pursuit of the changes with food and body image do not bring the self-worth that someone is really hoping for, and actually it makes them feel even worse. But usually beneath an eating disorder, someone generally has very low feelings of self-worth. So when we think about an eating disorder, we often think about sort of skeletal bodies, someone being emaciated. We tend to think of like the young adolescent white, teenage girl often. And we often tend to think as well that if someone has an eating disorder, that it's going to be really, really visible, and that we're going to be finding this really, they're going to stand out. It's going to be very noticeable. And of course, in relation to anorexia nervosa, it is the eating disorder that you'll tend to hear more about in the media, as there are often more casualties to this illness, because it is the mental health condition with the highest mortality rate. So I think we've all experienced, haven't we, sort of the dramatic media headlines and, like sad news about people losing their lives to anorexia nervosa. So of course, anorexia nervosa is a very relevant and serious eating disorder, but it's really the tip of the growing iceberg of eating disorders. And many, many people suffering with eating disorders are actually normal weight or overweight, and their symptoms are hidden. And they are still experiencing disordered eating behaviours, a daily preoccupation and distress around food. But of course, their symptoms are often hidden, and this is really, really tricky. And research has shown that 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight. So that's a very high statistic, isn't it? 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight. We also know as well that eating disorders affect people across all ethnic groups, affect people of all genders, affect people, from different cultures, affect people of all ages. But we still tend to very much focus on the sort of stereotypical eating disorder presentation. But I guess what I want to just really flag in this podcast is eating disorders are so much more than that. And it's probably very likely that you have someone in your life at the moment that you may or may not be aware of who is suffering from an eating disorder, but you may be completely oblivious to that because of it might not have seemed obvious, because I guess eating disorders do not have a look. I think also what's worth mentioning is in our culture, many people as well struggle with disordered eating behaviours, even though perhaps they don't have a full diagnosis of an eating disorder. And I think, again, this is where we make the mistake in the culture of kind of thinking that eating disorders are something that a distinct minority group of people experience, whereas we assume everyone else has kind of got a healthy relationship with food, etc. And that is not the case, because I guess we live in a culture that tends to praise weight loss, idealise thinness, never mind the route taken to achieve the end goal. I've worked with so many people who have been involved in slimming clubs, lost vast amounts of weight, but actually been suffering with an eating disorder, all along, but perhaps never realised they had an eating disorder because they were absolutely praised and validated for their weight loss because they were in a larger body. And we live in a culture which is very weight-centric in defining health. So we tend to focus on body mass index and numbers as a way of determining whether someone is healthy or not. And we know from research from the Health at Every Size movement that actually the weight-centric approach is not the only way to be looking at health, and actually it's quite limiting. And actually healthy behaviours and how someone is living out healthy behaviours in their life is a much better indicator of health. So things like how they manage their sleep, their stress, intuitive eating, movement, etc. Also with the body mass index, if you have a larger body, if you're naturally in a larger body, maybe you're tall, you're bigger boned, you have a larger muscle mass, you might not fit into the conventional body mass index, BMI kind of ranges. And then you may have decided and been told by people around you when you were very young that actually you were overweight and you needed to lose weight, and you then started on this whole kind of dieting roller coaster and then developed disordered eating behaviors, or maybe even an eating disorder. So I think it's just really helpful, before I dive into the specific types of eating disorders, just to recognize actually that eating disorders are not just something that affects a minority of people. Many people in our culture have eating disorders that are hidden. Many people in our culture as well are struggling with disordered eating behaviours. And I think it's just really helpful that we start to have more of these conversations, raise more awareness about this, and help people be able to ask for help, and also to identify when they are actually struggling with food and body image. So historically as well, with an eating disorder, you are often wrongly deemed not sick enough or not ill enough for treatment unless your weight was descending to alarming levels. So thankfully, again, the tide is turning and eating disorders are being recognised in people of all different shapes and sizes. And I guess, again, something that's helpful to recognise is that early intervention is so helpful for eating disorders and can prevent what could be just a kind of mental health chapter of your life, which has, gone a bit off kilter, to prevent that turning into a lifelong struggle with food. So let's talk a bit about eating disorders as well as a psychological coping strategy. So why would someone choose not to eat, or to self-induce vomiting, or to punishingly exercise for hours on end? And I guess an eating disorder is a psychological coping strategy, not one that is chosen with conscious thought, but one that can firmly embed in someone's psyche and then limit their motivation to change. So things like gentle encouragement to eat more from well-meaning loved ones will likely be met with a lot of resistance, huge ambivalence and fear. So the eating disorder almost becomes this kind of life raft, this sort of safety thing in the turbulent sort of waters of life. Time for a short advertisement break. Do you want to overcome binge eating, transform your relationship with food and gain mental clarity? Physicians, loved one trainers and even therapists have probably told you to restrict or get on another special eating program. You likely feel invalidated, misunderstood and ashamed. You're at the end of your tether and you don't know where to turn. It is on your darkest days, in the darkest hours, when you long for freedom from binge eating in the UK, in the US and everywhere in between. You've been on diet after diet and you just can't do it anymore. Sign up for Dr. Marianne Miller's self-paced virtual binge eating monthly membership program. For those of you who are at your wit's end with food, the goal is to regain mental and emotional energy by shifting your relationship with food to be fully present in your life. Sign up for this membership program and end binge eating for good. Sign up now and get $20 off the monthly $99 fee. Use the discount code Harriet. So that's $20 off the usual price of $99. Use the discount code Harriet, HARRIET. Link is in the show notes. So if someone is already suffering from quite low self-esteem, in the culture that praises thinness, the drive to control weight, to control food, to exercise obsessively, it can bring a fleeting boost to self-esteem when someone feels that they're kind of meeting their targets and their goals. And often people around them might really praise what they're doing initially because of, again, in the culture, being quite strict with your food, doing a lot of exercise can be seen as sort of almost like a morally superior thing to do. And there's so much fear about becoming overweight that we can inadvertently, unconsciously sometimes praise what has become quite disordered eating patterns for someone without even realising it. So also a preoccupation and with food can be a welcome escape from difficult emotions and a distraction from the ups and downs of life. I know many of my clients have said to me, focusing on food and my body just simplifies life. It means that I just have to focus on how many steps I've done, how many calories I've eaten. And it means that all the other kind of bigger problems fade into the background. And in a way, life becomes simplified and in some ways more manageable because it's one thing that's totally yours to control. So an eating disorder as well can be a cry for help. It can be a way of communicating to others when it feels impossible to communicate this through words. And sometimes people will feel that they just have lost their voice. They feel they don't have permission to have a voice. They feel quite unworthy. They feel that they have been overlooked or unnoticed by people around them. This is not necessarily anyone's fault. Sometimes just life happens and for whatever reason that person doesn't get their needs met. So an eating disorder can be a way of communicating, I guess, particularly for eating disorders when you are changing a lot in your body size, whether that's either getting a lot thinner or gaining weight. And when life is out of control, controlling food can bring comfort and predictability that other life areas can't offer. So it's no surprise that NHS referrals for eating disorders absolutely skyrocketed during the pandemic, and that we're still dealing with this aftermath because that was a really out of control period, a really fearful period for so many people. And I think many people will say, food is the one thing in my life that I can totally control. It's totally, totally mine. So let's look closer at the main eating disorders. So number one, anorexia nervosa. So anorexia nervosa involves intense restriction of food, usually through calorie counting, omitting food groups, or simply not eating enough. And it can be disguised through the veil of clean eating. Maybe you're being healthy, really when underneath though lurks a terrible fear of weight gain, and this can be really difficult for people to admit to. So sometimes as well, people with anorexia can purge through use of vomiting or laxatives, and then this becomes known as purging subtype anorexia nervosa. So if you have anorexia nervosa and you're female, you will likely have loss of periods because of your weight will sort of fall to a point where your body is not able to kind of maintain these kind of what the body almost seems as unnecessary functions when you're in starvation. And loss of sex drive as well is common across all genders. So there's this strong desire to kind of lose weight, and that can happen gradually. It can happen more slowly. It really depends on the person. So when someone has anorexia nervosa, the impact of starvation on the body is often quite momentous, and someone with anorexia will experience physical and mental complications which will interfere with living. So things like poor concentration, isolation, tiredness, feeling cold, and a constant gnawing and obsession with food. Food predominates all the time. So if you have anorexia nervosa, most people with anorexia will still be treated in a community setting as an outpatient rather than going into hospital. But then sometimes people will need to go into hospital for more intensive support. And that's particularly when people have lost weight very rapidly, or when they've become really, really kind of low weight and they're just not able to function and make helpful decisions. They really need that extra support. So successful treatment for anorexia nervosa absolutely involves a motivational approach to really engage the sufferer in the process of change, and families can be really supportive and helpful in that process. So no one can be forced to recover from anorexia nervosa. They need to get to that point themselves where they want to make the change, and it can be really, really tricky because I think someone with anorexia nervosa as well will often be sort of in denial and very unmotivated to change. And they may be in a period for quite a while where they feel they're not doing anything wrong, where they kind of in a way quite like the illness, or it's serving some really powerful functions. And if people around them try to help, support, intervene, that might be met with a lot of hostility. And I think as well, because of when someone is in a state of starvation, they are not going to be responding in the way that they would have been when they were at a more healthy weight. So they'll be a lot more irritable, a lot more anxious, a lot more rigid, lost their sense of humour. So it's far more difficult to be able to kind of access them and to be able to have like more helpful conversations that you may have done previously. So it can be incredibly difficult, if someone's suffering from anorexia, just for that person, but also for people around them too. Okay, the next eating disorder I want to talk about is bulimia nervosa. So bulimia nervosa is something that I personally suffered from myself for nearly a decade. Bulimia involves alternative periods of restrictive eating and then interspersed with binge eating, where there's a significant loss of control around food, and then after you binge eat you end up purging normally. So what is a binge? So binge involves eating a considerable amount of food, often several thousand calories in one sitting. Food is eaten rapidly in secret. It's often quite euphoric in the initial stages, but then very quickly afterwards there's a lot of shame and disgust and distress around what's happened. So following a binge, someone will generally purge the food by vomiting, taking laxatives, or compulsively exercising. And these cycles can be relentless and extremely distressing. And I think with bulimia, initially, the kind of drive to binge is often sort of stimulated by that extreme restriction. But very quickly, it becomes a way of coping with emotions, and it gets very messy and very sort of tangled up, and it can feel like a very addictive cycle, particularly if someone has a high level of restrictive eating between their binges, and particularly if they're perhaps holding their weight below their sort of their set point and where their body is happy. So bulimia as well can be dangerous because electrolytes, that's the sodium and potassium in the body, can become very imbalanced, and this can impact heart function. Teeth can be really eroded by stomach acid through purging, and cheeks become puffy as salivary glands work overtime to neutralize the stomach acid. And people with bulimia can be any shape or size, and the illness is often hidden from others. So it's one of those eating disorders which is not often visible. People with eating disorders are often very good at hiding their symptoms, and I'd say this is particularly true as well with bulimia. Someone with bulimia might present a very coping, happy, all-together front to the outside world, when behind closed doors, it is a very different matter. And I guess someone with bulimia is kind of expressing that through the food, like in a way out in the world, they might appear to eat normally, they may be a healthy weight, everything might seem perfectly normal. But then behind closed doors, maybe it's very chaotic and restrictive, and the complete sort of opposite from what people show in public. But I guess again this kind of mirrors as well. Often someone with bulimia might be quite people pleasing, happy, etc. out in the world, and behind closed doors actually really struggling with low mood, anxiety, and all kinds of other things. So the next eating disorder to talk about is binge eating disorder. So binge eating disorder shares the same restriction and binge eating behaviour seen in bulimia nervosa. However, it has the absence of the purging element. So binge eating disorder causes extreme distress, physical and emotional discomfort, and people with binge eating disorder as well can often gain significant weight from binging and maybe have sort of periods of real weight fluctuations when they're in more restrictive periods or more binge eating periods. With binge eating disorder, someone can feel incredibly isolated and alone when they're told by society, just to simply eat less and move more, with the illness lingering like a sort of shameful shadow in the background. So often as well, if you have binge eating disorder, there might always be another diet looming on the horizon, seen as the solution to all the problems. But of course, ultimately, this ignores the psychological coping component, and actually it just makes things worse, and someone can be then perpetually stuck in this relentless diet binge cycle. So many people out there have been suffering with binge eating disorder for a very long time and not even realising that they have had an issue with binge eating. And particularly perhaps while simultaneously they have been very much sort of involved in the slimming club world, where they've been praised for their weight loss. So it's been very confusing in a way to get a lot of validation from society about the more restrictive eating behaviours, but then actually these were leading to binges, and then this element was not actually addressed at all. Okay, the next category is OSFED, which is commonly known as other specified feeding or eating disorder. Of course, a very easily memorable name not. So basically, most people will actually fall into OSFED, and this just means that you don't fall neatly into anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder, but you may have some of the symptoms of each of those eating disorders, but perhaps you don't fit neatly into a diagnostic box. So that's where you would then meet the criteria for OSFED. In previous years, OSFED wasn't even really recognised as an eating disorder. I mean, it used to be called EDNOS, eating disorder not otherwise specified. But in the past, if you had OSFED/EDNOS, you wouldn't really get help because you were seen to not be sort of thin enough, ill enough, all those kind of toxic messages, which thankfully are changing. And now we're realising that 85% of people with eating disorders are not even underweight, that we need to have a much broader definition. So anyone that has OSFED should take their condition seriously as well and seek treatment as such. So OSFED can include things like atypical anorexia nervosa. Atypical, I think, is not a helpful term at all, but essentially means that someone has all the signs and symptoms and behaviours of anorexia, but actually their weight remains within a healthy or sort of overweight range. So they might be in a state of starvation, they might be extremely restrictive, counting calories, doing all the behaviours, suffering physically and mentally. However, they don't have that low BMI. So that is called atypical anorexia nervosa, that comes under the OSFED umbrella. So many people who are naturally more muscular, tall, or in larger bone bodies might actually meet the diagnosis for atypical anorexia nervosa under this OSFED umbrella. So sadly, many people in our culture can be unwittingly praised for their weight loss by those around them when actually they're suffering from atypical anorexia nervosa. So I think, again, it's so important to say these things out loud because historically as a culture we haven't really understood this. Now, another eating disorder now I want to mention, which isn't a kind of proper kind of diagnosable eating disorder, but it's something that you may have heard talked about a lot in the media and I think is worth a mention, and this is orthorexia. So it's not an official eating disorder, but it's a term we often hear sort of talked about a lot in our culture. So many people can develop eating disorders as well through what I'd call an orthorexic route, and this is where there's a fixation on being very, very healthy or clean eating. So it's to an excessive extreme where it results in people eliminating different food groups, and it becomes an obsessive and compulsive thing where people are really, really rigid. There's huge anxiety around food, and ultimately it's not healthy. It's different from healthy eating. And someone with orthorexia, they may fit into any of the other eating disorder categories. They may become very underweight, so they have anorexia nervosa. They may be kind of restricting through an orthorexic route, but then having binge and purge episodes, and then they would meet bulimia nervosa diagnosis. They may be restrictive through their clean eating practices and then have big binges, then they would meet the diagnosis of a binge eating disorder, or they may fall under that OSFED umbrella. So I think that's worth mentioning, that orthorexic route, because I think particularly with the advent of wellness culture in the last decade or so, more and more people have fallen into eating disorders via that route, perhaps in contrast to the past where it was through more traditional dieting. And then the last category I want to mention is ARFID. So ARFID is Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. So this definitely warrants a mention, but it almost needs another podcast for discussion really, because ARFID is slightly different from the other eating disorders because there's not the preoccupation around weight and shape that you see with the other eating disorders. Also, I know from my training and in terms of how eating disorders are being treated, ARFID was never ever treated in NHS. Well, in the NHS service that I worked in, ARFID would have been treated under more general mental health services rather than in the eating disorder service. So again, it's always been seen as something that's slightly separate and, just seen in a slightly different way, I guess. But I think nowadays it's starting to be seen much more as an eating disorder. And the main difference with ARFID compared to the other eating disorders is there's not usually that desire to change weight, but rather an aversion to food in regards to taste, texture, the sight of food, So it could be a sensory-based food aversion, a loss of appetite or a loss of interest in food, or even a fear of eating due to abdominal pain or vomiting. So like you can see, the motivation for not eating is very, very different. People can often become underweight and could sort of develop a more sort of traditional eating disorder via the ARFID route. But generally it's not so weight shape focused, it's more about these other kind of issues. But anyone that has ARFID could be really vulnerable to developing a weight shape eating disorder in our culture because of, for example, if you have ARFID as a child and you have historically been very underweight, then when you go through puberty and you experience all the kind of pressure to be thin and diet culture, etc., and then you naturally kind of start to gain weight, as everyone does through that period, it can feel really uncomfortable if your identity has very much been around being sort of smaller. And if you've already got some of those food issues, you could be more vulnerable. And that's not to say that everyone with ARFID is going to develop an eating disorder. Absolutely not. But I think it's something to watch out for. But I would just say to you as well, if you want to know more about ARFID, I would just have put ARFID into the Apple podcast or Spotify podcast search. And I'm sure there are a wealth of brilliant podcasts out there where you can get more information on that, because I really don't feel quite so qualified to talk to you about ARFID. So I guess in summary, eating disorders are complex psychological illnesses, and the criteria of being very low weight will only capture a minority of sufferers. Eating disorders affect people of all shapes, all sizes, all ages, all genders, across all cultures, across all ethnic groups. Okay, so and eating disorders are often hidden. 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight. So yeah, I just really want to kind of raise awareness about this. So if you want to find out more, do go to the BEAT website. That's beateatingdisorders.org.uk, and that's where you can find out a lot more information about eating disorders. That's the UK website. I'm sure there's like an equivalent one for the US, but do go and seek out resources if you are new to this whole area. And do seek help early. If you are listening to this and you recognise that you're struggling with an eating disorder, do seek help early. They've really shown through research that if you can access help in the first 3 years, it really does improve the outcome of recovery. But it's never too late. I have interviewed people on here and worked with people that have recovered from an eating disorder after decades. So never give up. It's never too late. Yeah, you deserve to get the help you need. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the eating disorder therapist _. You might want to join my bite-sized therapy if you want extra podcasts, extra video content, extra psychological kind of tips and skills from the therapy room. Go to the link in the show notes. You can find out more there. You might want to join our transformational event on Saturday the 30th of September. Lots of professionals coming together in eating disorders and body image, inspiring prevention, really thinking about these issues. Going to be loads of people there. It's going to be inspiring, uplifting, transformative day. And if you enjoy this podcast, I'd be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.